everyone, in this video I'm going to be trying to summarize and cover all the topics centered around one of the greatest works in the world of letters, Oliver Twist. However, all my remarks and critics are going to be given to the version beautifully retold by Richard Rogers. Before I begin summarizing the story, I want to give a small amount of information about the original author, who happens to be Charles Dickens. He was a popular English writer and social critic who lived in the Victorian era. As a literary genius, he was extensively known and beloved, but his works are still being translated and referenced around the globe. Perhaps also as his second novel, Oliver Twist, might be the most celebrated and recognized work of Charles Dickens. After the positive backlash his first classic work received, he then quickly pursued a longer career as a novelist. Beginning with the serialization of Oliver Twist as the parish boys progressed, the book was favored so much that the fans were demanding the next volumes to come out as soon as possible. For this video, I've decided to divide all the existing plots into 5 separate parts, so that I can first summarize and then analyze in plain terms, while still being able to enjoy the adventure of our protagonist, Oliver Twist. So without any further ado, let's get started.
Part 1. In a night of heavy rain, Oliver's mother arrives at the gate of a parish workhouse to give birth to Oliver. It was uncertain whether the child was going to survive in the first 3 minutes, as the nurse found him too frail. Meanwhile, Oliver's father was missing without showing any reason or any kind of instruction to the reader beforehand in the book, and his mother died of a broken heart just after giving birth to Oliver, which is also the part that struck me the most. I'm going to be talking about it later on. Thus, he was an orphan at birth, and he was forced to be raised with his fellow orphans. Lady Luck, who was his caretaker in the orphanage till the age of 9, always passed the food evenly amongst all the children so that they would not be fully satiated or hungry. As it's also simplified in the book, Lady Luck also knew what was good for herself, so she kept the money for her own use that she was essentially given for the children in need of care. Part 2. At the age of 9, Oliver was taken from the orphanage to a workhouse where he toiled for hours with bare food, just like the older children who were seemingly caged there. However, it did not take much long for him to get punished for nothing but asking for more food. He was soon sent off to work with Mr. Sowerberry, who is a coffin maker, and his coffin shop was both where they labored and stayed as dwelling. The misery hasn't come to an end, most especially at the times where Mr. Sowerberry was not around, and Oliver was left along with Mrs. Sowerberry, who constantly scolded, ill-treated, and underfed him. One day, out of nowhere, Noah, who is Oliver's fellow apprentice, started humiliating and insulting Oliver's deceased mother. Oliver got extremely enraged and had a fight with Noah, who is both older and physically stronger, yet Oliver was still capable of knocking him down until Mrs. Sowerberry instantly intervened shortly after hearing Noah scream and helped him out to beat Oliver. After being accused and overlooked, poor Oliver was mercilessly beaten by Mrs. Sowerberry just to pacify his wife. That night, Oliver decided to break away. Therefore, he waited till the morning, and once it was a daybreak, he wrapped up a very little amount of food and then snuck out and ran away to London with the thought of a better life. Part 3. When he was approaching London, Oliver encountered 2 boys, the artful Dodger and Charles Spade. Unfortunately, you will understand why I said this. They successfully persuaded Oliver by feeding him and offering him a rent-free, secure shelter to live, provided by an old gentleman. Oliver was easily convinced that Fagin with all the other boys were reliable, and they would make wallets and handkerchiefs for a living until the following day, when he tagged along with the hope for a handkerchief-making adventure with 2 boys, Dodger and Bate. He then witnessed that Dodger and Bate stole the handkerchief of a posh gentleman in public, who latterly mistook Oliver for young pickpockets and caught Oliver after the actual pickpockets already fled the scene, leaving him behind. Part 4. Mr. Brownlow, the well-groomed gentleman whose handkerchief was pickpocketed, afterwards adopted Oliver, realizing that the boy was a well-mannered orphan and had a very gentle heart. Luckily, in this period of time, Oliver was receiving a loving and sportive home and family he always deserved. Mr. Brownlow embraced him with compassion and tenderness himself was devoid of, but accidentally one day, while Oliver was on his way to bring some books to the bookseller, as he was tasked with, he got kidnapped by Fagin and Nancy, who is one of Fagin's accomplices. Meanwhile, Mr. Brownlow was upholding his patience and hoping for the little boy to return without any knowledge about the incidents. Part 5. In this final chapter, all the suffering and maltreatment that Oliver was exposed to eventually enlightened, and it was latterly discovered that the reason why Fagin and his accomplices were after Oliver is that they were seeking Oliver's fortune all this time. They were the only people who knew about Oliver's large inheritance from his deceased father. Justice was served to each and every one of them. Oliver Twist lived his life contentedly with his new parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brownlow. Part 1. Young Oliver Twist was brought into the world of poverty as an orphan, and Charles Dickens was one of the rare authors who narrated the poverty and the bitter effects of industrialization in the 19th century. Oliver Twist has similarities with many other novels that Dickens had produced to show the injustice and the struggle of the poor in order to give us a realistic perspective from the Britain of 19th century. He gives us Oliver Twist as a title character, both as a representation of the poor children under the influence of immoral love system and industry, also as to show us the innocence and purity of poor living that is completely disregarded by the upper class. Dickens criticizes the law system and demonstrates how ridiculously ineffective, fruitless they are by mainly using satire in his work. Immoral characters are emphasized on how foolishly obnoxious they are, in fact, as if the author makes them off in his work. There are two scenes appeared in the book that hit me right in the feelings. The first scene, as it's introduced in the movies based on this novel, the very first upfront scene in the workhouse where Oliver's mother says, "Let me see my child," and die, and then she holds her newborn baby and kisses on his forehead, then actually dies. It was pretty soulful and even devastating, since it's not a special case for this novel, but also something that happens in real life. Part 2. Perhaps the best person to show us forms of cruelty and abuse happening in workhouses is Charles Dickens, since we know that he had to work in a warehouse as a child labor after dropping out of school due to lack of money. The book also successfully covers the aspects of how orphans were being exploited and harassed in the short version. This is the turning point for Oliver's ongoing pursuit for a better place. Besides, it's a pure indication of his growth and ability of making his own decisions, since he becomes more aware of the wicked society, more particularly for his recent experience he gained in the coffin shop. Part 3. After 7 days of walk, our hero meets Artful Dodger and is certainly convinced his faithfulness. Yet, to be frank, it's almost impossible to not buy into Dodger's promises, particularly considering poor Oliver's state of mind in such a young age. The generous old gentleman turned out to be Fagin, who's our main antagonist in the story, and it was constantly emphasized that he was a Jew, which drew a lot of criticism from both people and other authors. Shortly afterwards in the story, we can deduce from the general situation that the evil criminal Fagin is notorious for abducting young boys from streets to turn them into pickpockets and take advantage of their innocence, which partly explains why he's completely isolated from the society and lives behind the scenes. Part 4. The crowd run after the actual pickpockets, accidentally caught innocent Oliver and want to punish him, but he was later then clarified and by chance met Mr. Brownlow in the courtroom. The same day Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver, and now the young boy was finally in safe hands, living along with his new wealthy and virtuous family. Having said that, just like in numerous amazing films, the author did not hesitate to bring up the twist into our stagnant story. And all of a sudden, the story took a U-turn, and our hero got kidnapped by Fagin and his accomplice Nancy in broad daylight. Worthless to note the reader's comprehension, the true natures of each character is unavoidable to overlook, certainly owing to the author's ability of displaying them in the most explicit way possible. Dickens did not attempt to disguise their real identities. For instance, Fagin as the leader of a group of children whom he teaches to make their livings by pickpocketing and all the other criminal activities in exchange for a shelter was directly worked out, just like Beyza was a malicious criminal in Fagin's gang and a vicious robber and murderer at the same time. Meanwhile, Nancy was also an eventual victim of Beyza as well as she was a thief. For all these bold and explicit characters, Dickens was rather censured for being exaggerative by all the other authors, yet it did not impact his readers as much. Part 5. Now let's talk about the ending of this story. In my humble opinion, the ending was way too obvious. It could have been much better for people like me who like unexpected tragedies or twists. Yet I still enjoyed the ending, especially considering Oliver's whole life was a tragedy itself and almost no one pitied him. It just did not make me overthink or read again, but it was definitely a relief knowing everything ended pleasantly. More or less, we all knew the story was going to have a happy ending, and perhaps it's even quite reasonable at this point. The novel may not amaze us with a sudden change in the process of Oliver's life, but it definitely reminds us to maintain our hope and trust for the future, despite of horrible things may be happening to such innocent people. The ending I will be introducing is going to be much different, much saddening and perhaps even depressing, but in my own regards it's a pretty decent representation of a forgotten person that created a happy place and broke the connection with the real world, mainly due to his main mental illness called schizophrenia. Oliver Twist is actually the only character all this time in my ending, and he has been striving to survive the trauma he lived in because of the sudden death of his new family, who adopted him at a young age. However, he can't remember the reason of their deaths. He keeps seeing a certain scene of that memory, not exactly knowing where it's from. In the final chapter, he's still quite young, and he's only having those everlasting dreams wide awake. He reimagines the events that happened as a child in his home over and over again, but always changes the bad events into delighted and joyful stories, and he is the main character in this imaginative movie. He plays and talks to the things around him and does not leave the house ever, till he decides to play in a different role that he was reflected by his unconscious mind, but he doesn't know that is going to be his last dream. In this dream, he is a private detective and helps to find the son of a strange woman, and by the end, as it can be understood from the scene of him being frightened by his own dead body, he found, now it's clear that the strange woman was his deceased mother, and by solving the mystery, Oliver's spirit is finally set free. The scene gives some clues that he'd been disrupting his medicines and eating. Oliver Twist only has been seeing hallucinations without sleeping for the last few days, and eventually intolerable hunger and cold brought his life to an end, but at least his ghost was liberated eternally, giving him the opportunity of living in his dreams.